Hi, I'm Ollie, and in this video I'm going to go through 7 key examples from the past year of American politics and government that you can use in your Paper 3 Edexcel US Politics and Government exam in a couple of weeks' time. All of the examples we're going to go through are from the document you can see on your screen, which you can purchase on the Politics Explained website. It's an updated example pack with loads and loads of examples to help up from the past year to help you in your exam on the 10th of June. There's 35 pages in total. So the ones we're going to have a look at are some of the real most important ones, some really key ones. There's loads of other really important ones to use that you can use in your exam as well. Also on the Politics Explained website, you can find loads of other resources to help you in your Politics A-level and to prepare for that third exam, including detailed plans for essay plans for US politics, also 12 marker plans for US politics, and a place to sign up for some webinars I'm going to be running over May half term, and those are going to be on both Paper 2 and Paper 3. And we got really good feedback for the ones on Paper 1, so hopefully a lot of you join us for those on Paper 2 and Paper 3 as well in May half term. Yeah, without further ado, let's get into it. The first example we're going to have a look at then is a Supreme Court case. And this is a really good example in relation to a number of things, in relation to the presidency, in relation to the Supreme Court, in relation to checks and balances. As with a lot of this US paper, a lot of the content kind of is really useful for different topics. So this is the Department of State versus AIDS Vaccine Advocacy Coalition 2025. And effectively, it was on the 5th of March of this year when the Supreme Court voted 5-4 to overturn a Trump administration executive order titled Reevaluating and Realigning the United States Foreign Aid. Effectively, this executive order passed by Trump or written by Trump had paused all foreign aid funds from being given out. And Chief Justice Roberts, and Amy Coney Barrett joined the 3 Liberal justices to create that 5-4 majority and ruled that Congress had already decided where the $2 billion in foreign aid would be spent through legislation, meaning that the executive didn't have this power to pass an executive order to unilaterally withhold these funds and decide not to spend them. And this really is important, as it shows how the Supreme Court's power of judicial review is an important check on presidential power. It can also protect Congress's power, as it can declare actions of the executive unconstitutional and reverse them in the same way they can reverse legislation passed by Congress. And in many cases, this is really important in clarifying the separation of powers between Congress and the presidency, and therefore protects the power of Congress, as I mentioned. Crucially, really interestingly, it also shows how justices can vote differently to how they would be expected, as Barrett was appointed by Trump as a very conservative judge in his first term. But it's becoming quite clear in the past year there's been a number of decisions where she hasn't completely aligned with the other conservative justices, and potentially is prepared to go away from Trump's kind of views or strong conservative views and be a bit more moderate in her rulings, and this is a really good example of that. The next example we're going to have a look at then is really useful in relation to the importance of incumbency in congressional elections, but also is of course really useful in relation to interest groups and the role of campaign finance generally in the United States. And that's that 2 members of the squad, in particular Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush, both lost their primary races in the 2024 election cycle to better funded candidates. So these are effectively radical left-wing Democrats, Bowman and Bush, and they remember members of the squad. They're further to the left on the Democratic Party, kind of similar to AOC, Bernie Sanders, for example. And they were both defeated by moderates in their primaries. And importantly, these moderates were more supportive of Israel, which was a key issue in the election, in the 2024 election. Bowman's challenger, George Latimer, was backed by interest group AIPAC, the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, leading to the most expensive primary campaign on record. So over $14 million was spent by AIPAC on TV ads, which was 7 times more than Bowman's spending. And this underscores, firstly, the significance of campaign finance in fighting US elections, where well-funded candidates can defeat their poorly funded counterparts. Normally, that's effectively well-funded incumbents, because they're better funded, defeating challengers, but it was actually the opposite here. It also shows the limits to the incumbency effect in congressional elections. In recent years, it's become far more common for incumbents to face primary challenges from within their own party, and that be a key reason why they've been defeated. Okay, the next example we're going to have a look at then is a little bit complicated, but for me it's really important and really useful, and that's in relation to Congress's oversight function over the president, particularly in unified government, because currently we have unified government in the United States where the president is a Republican, the Senate has a Republican majority, as does the House of Representatives. And effectively, there's an argument that this results in ineffective scrutiny of the presidency, ineffective oversight, and I think the last kind of 5 months of the Trump presidency are a really good example of that, where Congress has really failed to stand up to the Trump presidency and exercise its oversight powers that are given to it in the Constitution effectively. And this is effectively potentially a threat, can be seen as a threat to democracy in the United States, as if there's unified government and Congress refuses effectively or doesn't use its oversight powers of the president correctly to hold them to account and protect the checks and balances and protect the Constitution. And there's a real threat of the presidency gaining in power too much, as the founding fathers were really worried about when they implemented a system of checks and balances. The first key kind of example of this is the fact that Trump fired inspectors general from 17 different government agencies. So these are auditors who are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate to tackle abuse of power, waste, and mismanagement in government, and therefore they were set up after Watergate and are really important effectively then in holding different presidential and executive departments, government agencies to account, and effectively scrutinizing them and making sure that they're not wasting money, they're not abusing power too much, they're not mismanaging in relation to government. So it's a really key form of oversight that Congress has introduced. However, Trump simply fired 17 of them, and Trump broke the law because Congress had introduced these by law and strengthened protections for them. However, this hasn't been met with pushback from Congress, which of course has, well, from the Republicans in Congress who have a majority. Republican senators largely supportive of the move, and John Barrasso, for example, said some of them deserve to be fired. And this shows how Congress is failing to assert its own oversight power, as when there's unified government, there's significant cooperation on trying to drive through a shared agenda between the Republicans in Congress and the Republicans in the presidency, and a real reluctance to do political damage to a president from the majority's party. And this is especially due to the fact that Trump really dominates the Republican Party. Crucially, it was also seen in the fact that Congress hasn't exercised its power of the purse, which is again one of the key checks on the president. And Trump challenged Congress's power of the purse in early 2025 when he unilaterally exceeded his constitutional authority and ordered a pause of all federal grants and loans to 2,600 programs, including farm subsidies and health research. And he justified this by saying federal spending should align with presidential priorities. It was also a bit of a part of this kind of Doge agenda led by Elon Musk to try and cut the size of the government and cut federal spending. Congress failed to challenge this executive order despite having the Congressional Review Act, which allowed them to pass legislation blocking an executive order. This again shows how Congress has been an ineffective check on the presidency. It isn't using its checks, it isn't using the power of the purse. It has accepted moves that undermine their own power, and really shows how in unified government there can be ineffective oversight of the president. Okay, the next example we're going to have a look at then is in relation to executive orders, which are a key informal source of presidential powers. They're not written down in the Constitution as a clear kind of formal presidential power, but they've developed over time, and are a key way that presidents, particularly when they first come into the presidency in the first couple of months of their presidency, whether it's their first or their second term, really seek to stamp their mark on the presidency and make some quick changes. And on his first day in office, so this is actually his first day in office of his second term, Trump broke the record for the most executive orders signed on any president's first day. And in his first week, he signed 33 in total. And these were really significant changes. So executive orders, effectively, they're not full laws, but they're orders that the government, that the executive, the president, can use to make really significant changes. And you can see some of these significant changes, including leaving the World Health Organization, the Paris Agreement, and suspending all foreign aid for 3 months. In relation to domestic policy, it also included eliminating all diversity, equity, and inclusion practices in the government, declaring a national emergency at the southern border, and mandating all, and actually that declaring of a national emergency gave him the power to implement loads of tariffs, which we've seen, and mandating all federal agencies to define someone's gender the same as their sex assigned at birth. These major shifts in US policy, both foreign and domestic, were achieved without any checks on presidential power from the other branches of government. And this suggests that there's been a transformation of the office of the president to an imperial presidency, you could use, that's able to pursue their agenda mainly through executive action rather than Congress. And of course, executive orders are a really key part of that. They're official documents directing the operations of federal agencies and providing instructions to the executive branch about how to interpret the law. However, Trump's first day also highlights the key weaknesses of executive action, because Trump rolled back 78 of Biden's executive actions in one executive order in his first week, including those related to improving racial equality in the federal government. And this shows how, as executive actions don't require congressional approval, they're really vulnerable, because another president come in and can simply issue another executive order to rescind all of the previous president's executive orders. Okay, the next example we're going to have a look at then is in relation to Biden and the final 6 months of his presidency. This is a really, probably the clearest for me, one of the clearest in history, example of a lame duck presidency from any president. So Biden dropped out the 2024 presidential race eventually on 21st of July, largely due to concerns over his age and cognitive capabilities. And after being replaced by his vice president, Kamala Harris, as the 2024 presidential candidate, there was very little focus on Biden, on his decisions, and there was a perception that she had more control over the White House decision making than Biden himself. His influence over international affairs decreased significantly, with other leaders prioritizing relationships with Harris and Trump. And then his power was even more limited following the election of Trump on the 5th of November. Trump began to meet with foreign leaders, including Zelensky and Keir Starmer, before he became president, and is reported to also have played a key role in the ceasefire and hostage deal between Israel and Hamas by pressuring Netanyahu to do so. And Trump was also able to prevent a TikTok ban even before becoming president by announcing action he would take as president. So together, this shows that effectively in the last 6 months, Biden had very, very little power, and it shows how a president's power can change across their term. And a key part of that is that in the final months, they can be a lame duck president with very little power, very little influence, and being superseded by other political figures, especially after an election that they lose or they don't even compete in. Okay, the next example we're going to have a look at is Trump's refusal to comply with the Supreme Court as an example of the limits of the Supreme Court's power. So in April, the Supreme Court temporarily barred the Trump administration from deporting a group of Venezuelan migrants under the controversial Alien Enemies Act. The American Civil Liberties Union, a pressure group and interest group, appealed to the court. So it also shows how a key method used by interest groups in the United States is through the courts, and effectively appealing government decisions. And they argued that the migrants would be denied due process and judicial review. So crucially, this shows how the courts are playing a key role in checking the power of the president and enforcing key constitutional principles, in this case, the Fifth Amendment, as they effectively barred the Trump administration from doing something because he wasn't upholding, the presidency wasn't upholding the law. It also shows how interest groups, as I said, can have impact on government policy, as constitutional sovereignty allows them to appeal to the courts. However, on the other hand, while the Trump administration abided by this particular ruling and didn't deport this group of Venezuelan migrants, the administration did continue to deport other Venezuelan migrants without judicial review, and also refused to comply, on the other hand, with a unanimous Supreme Court ruling that the administration must facilitate the return of a migrant who is wrongly deported to El Salvador, saying that he wouldn't come back to the United States. So on the one hand, this shows how in some cases the Supreme Court can have power, but crucially a big shift in relation to the Trump presidency is that it's willing in certain cases to not listen to the judiciary, to not listen to the Supreme Court. And that shows potentially, there's a good example you could use of how the Supreme Court's power has reduced and it's become somewhat ineffective in upholding rights, in this case, the Fifth Amendment. The final example we're going to have a look at then is in relation to interest groups, and that's the example of the interest group, the Heritage Foundation, and their Project 2025, which I'm sure you've heard about. The Heritage Foundation is a prominent conservative think tank and interest group in the United States that promotes very conservative policies, including limited government, free market capitalism, and really conservative positions on social issues. And prior to the 2024 presidential election, it published Project 2025, which is effectively a manifesto covering all aspects of policy and government that they intended for President Trump's team to learn from and drive through government. And they're really conservative and effectively aim to entrench conservative policies and interests in the United States for decades to come. And we can see that they've had a real impact on the Trump administration. Trump's already began to enact many of these policies. So Project 2025 recommended deconstructing the administrative state by firing thousands of employees, particularly those who didn't support the Republican Party. It's been pursued by the Department of Government Efficiency, led by Elon Musk. It recommended eliminating DEI programs, which Trump did through an executive order in his first week. It recommends dismantling the Department of Education to reduce federal oversight of education, which the Trump administration has begun to do so and signaled its intention to do so. It recommended the mass deportation of undocumented immigrants, which Trump has promised and began to act, and it recommended the dismantling of large portions of the Environmental Protection Agency and promotion of fossil fuel production, which Trump has begun to do through executive orders, and kind of effectively saying drill, baby, drill is quite a key mantra he was using in his first term, but also now in his second term. And also, not only has it had impact on Trump's administration policies, it's also had an impact on the Trump administration personnel. It effectively created in Project 2025 a database for key appointments where it recommended key people for key jobs who are supportive of Project 2025. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, who they're strongly supported, was chosen by Trump and appointed confirmed by the Senate, and they actually the Heritage Foundation launched a $1 million campaign advocating for his confirmation to the Senate during the Senate hearings. Similarly, the Director of the Office of Management and Budget, Russell Vought, was a co-author of Project 2025, and Vice President J.D. Vance has very strong ties to it. So together, this is a really good example, a clear example of the impact of an interest group in the United States by effectively influencing the policies of a major party, in this case the Republican Party, but also the personnel of the Trump administration. So yeah, hopefully you found that useful. As I mentioned, there's 35 pages of examples here covering all of the topics. So you can purchase this document if you'd like on the Politics Explained website, where, as I mentioned at the start, there's loads of other resources to help you in your politics A level, including some webinars, including on US politics. I'm going to be running in May half term. So yeah, feel free to sign up for that in the link in the description if you're interested. Let me know if you've got any comments or questions in the comment section below, and I'll see you in the next video.